It was the 10th of August 2018 and a young couple were going about their day in their Forest Lodge flat in New South Wales. The couple were 28-year-old Blake Davis, an aspiring actor who had landed some small roles on Australian television, and his girlfriend, 23-year-old Hannah Quinn. Suddenly, their front door flew open. Jett McKee, a 30-year-old aspiring rapper, had kicked in their door. He was high on the drug ice and was armed with knuckle dusters, cable ties and a replica gun. Concealing his identity with a balaclava, he yelled at the couple in the flat, "Give me all your effing money or I'll kill you." When Blake and Hannah refused to give Jett any money, Jett punched Blake in the head with the knuckle dusters, fracturing his eye socket and knocking him unconscious. He then grabbed Hannah's handbag and ran from the home. Instead of tending to Blake, who was bleeding on the floor, or calling the police, Hannah's instinct was to give chase and retrieve her bag. Hannah chased Jett 160 metres down the road and grappled with him, causing him to fall over. At this point, Blake had woken up and realised that Hannah was not there. He grabbed his imitation samurai sword for protection and ran after them in fear of his girlfriend's life. He saw Jett on the ground, allegedly pointing the fake gun at Hannah and saying, "I'm going to kill you. I know where your family live." It was then that Blake struck Jett once in the head with the sword, cracking his skull with a single blow. Bleeding profusely, Jett got up and attempted to get away. Hannah was terrified that he was going to come after them, so she turned to Blake and said, "Run." While Jett only made it another 80 metres down the road before he fell and died due to his injuries, the couple ran back to their flat. This is where the story takes an interesting turn. Instead of calling the police, they hid the sword in their backyard and hurriedly packed a bag with nunchucks, a toy pellet gun, and over $21,000 in cash. Blake and Hannah spent days on the run, checking in and out of several hotels, stating that they were scared for their lives and their families' lives. On the third day, they were in a taxi when they heard a news story on the radio, stating that Jett McKee had died from his injuries, and they decided to hand themselves in to police. Fast forward to 2020, and the case drew significant media attention, sparking debates on social media and among legal experts about the boundaries of self-defence and the moral dilemmas faced in life-threatening situations. But all was not as innocent as it first appeared. Hannah admitted to the court that she was a heavy user of cannabis at the time of the incident, and she had a large amount of cannabis in her home, but she did not see herself as a drug dealer. She was simply buying larger amounts so she was able to share it cheaply between her friends. She also admitted to having a large amount of money in her home, but denied that it was the proceeds of dealing drugs, saying simply that it was her savings. And Hannah actually had a brief history with Jett. She had bought cannabis from Jett's friend on several occasions in the past, and one of these times, Jett McKee had attended her home to make the transaction and saw that she had large amounts of money. So this was not a random attack. It was, in fact, a man with toxic to lethal amounts of the drug ice in his system, robbing who he thought was a drug dealer with large amounts of cash after he had lost all of his money due to gambling. This was not Jett's first home invasion either. He participated in a previous robbery several weeks prior, attacking someone with a crowbar. He and his drug-dealing friend had staked Blake and Hannah's home out for 2 days, planning how they would commit the attack. Hannah and Blake claimed that they had ran, not to evade police, but because they were in fear of their lives with the threats that Jett had made against them and their families. They did not even know that he had died until they heard a news report on the taxi radio, which was when they made the decision to turn themselves in. And the bag full of weapons? Blake claimed that it was his prop bag for acting, and the fact that he took this with them proved how confused and scared that they were at the time. Blake previously suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety, claiming that these conditions, along with Hannah's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, contributed to their response. The judge admitted that the home invasion would have been a horrifying experience for anyone, but more so for Blake with his mental health history. She admitted that Blake had no prior history of violence and was of good character until his recent involvement with cannabis. He was just reacting to the extraordinary event that occurred that day. While he was defending himself and his girlfriend, Jett was not an immediate threat at the time, therefore striking him in the head with the sword was an unreasonable response. The reason that he was not an immediate threat? Witnesses saw the attack from a distance and said that Jett did not, in fact, have the gun pointed at Hannah at the time of the blow, which is what Blake and Hannah had claimed. Both Blake and Hannah expressed their remorse of the outcome of the incident, but continued to claim that they were in fear of their lives. They both admitted that their lives will never be the same, and Blake said that he had died emotionally the day of the botched home invasion. Blake was found not guilty of murder, but charged with manslaughter by excessive self-defence and sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in jail, with a non-parole period of 2 years and 9 months. Hannah was also tried for murder, but the judge directed the jury to find her not guilty partway through her trial. Hannah was then convicted of being an accessory after the manslaughter and received a 2-year community corrections order. On the 11th of April 1996, 42-year-old Noel Anthony Connolly's life was cut short in Anthony's cutting, Bacchusmarsh, Victoria. Noel's body was found with more than 20 axe wounds, demonstrating what a vicious and cruel attack had taken place. Noel's death exposed a manipulative partner and her affair that ended in the brutal murder of Noel. Noel was known to be a kind and hard-working man. He was a car enthusiast and a devoted father of 2 children. He lived with his long-term partner Ivy Waite, and he thought that they were in a happy relationship. But all was not as it appeared. Noel and Ivy were attending an adult education centre, and it was here that Ivy met the people that would end Noel's life. While Noel was working, Ivy had begun having an affair with 28-year-old John Bewley Evans, who had an intellectual disability. Ivy capitalised on this and manipulated John by telling him that Noel beat her and the children and poured hot water on them. Driven by his infatuation with Ivy, John confided in his brother-in-law, Keith Baskin, 33, recounting these fabricated tales. Keith, haunted by his own traumatic childhood, was triggered to save Ivy and her children. He had a history of violence, having received a suspended sentence in 1990 for attacking someone with a hammer after being told that his victim was abusing his own wife and son. Fueled by his own demons, Keith was determined to make Noel suffer. Inspector Bernie Edwards, who was investigating the case at the time, stated, "John just wanted to bash Noel, but Keith, who had never met him, was far nastier and said, 'Why bash him? I'll kill him.'" On the night of the murder, John and Keith convinced Noel to come and assist them in picking up some car parts and then staged a breakdown in Anthony's cutting. When Noel offered to check the engine, Keith attacked him with a tomahawk that had been hidden in the car boot. Noel suffered over 20 wounds, primarily to his head, neck and hands, indicating a desperate attempt to defend himself. His body was later dumped in nearby bushes. John dropped Keith off at home before heading over to inform Ivy of the murder. Instead of mourning, Ivy and John gathered friends, bought champagne and celebrated Noel's death. Witnesses later recounted John holding a champagne bottle out of the car window, shouting, "Let's celebrate." The following morning, a farmer and his son discovered Noel's mutilated body, prompting a 6-month investigation. Ivy initially feigned shock when she was informed of Noel's murder by the police, but through great police work, officers were able to make a breakthrough. One woman's unusual fixation on the brutality of the crime raised suspicions, leading her to provide a new statement implicating Keith and John. During police interviews, both men blamed each other. John claimed that Keith alone was the attacker, while Keith claimed that he left to urinate before the attack, returning to find John striking Noel with the axe. However, this story unravelled when police presented the murder weapon, prompting Keith to claim that when he returned from urinating, he was given the axe, but that he only struck Noel once to the jaw and twice to the throat. Police dismissed this account, noting that the steep and dangerous terrain that he claimed to have crossed to urinate would have been near impossible in the dark. Both men were tried separately in the Supreme Court. the jury in Keith's case visited the crime scene, where they rejected his account of events once they saw the steep terrain surrounding the murder scene. In 1998, Keith was sentenced to 16 years in prison with a minimum of 12 years, while John received 14 years with a minimum of 9.5 years. But what about the alleged instigator of this murder? Ivy, described by the judge as manipulative, never faced charges. Although she had planted the idea of violence in John's mind, there was no evidence that she directly ordered Noel's murder. Shortly after the killing, Ivy attempted to claim thousands of dollars in crime compensation as Noel's de facto partner. However, after police informed her of their evidence, including the champagne celebration, she quietly dropped her claim. On New Year's Eve 2012, 18-year-old Lewis McPherson was walking to a party in Warradale, South Australia, with his friends James Lamont, 19, and Liam Trewartha, 18. Sadly, Lewis never made it to that party, nor did he live to see the new year. He was senselessly shot and killed by a drug-affected, alcohol-fueled teenager, Liam Humbles. Lewis was known by his family and friends as a lovable, happy and hard-working young man. Recently becoming a legal adult, he was full of optimism and ready to embrace what life had to offer. Tragically, his life was cut short by someone entirely opposite to him. 17-year-old Liam Humbles was described by those who knew him as paranoid, erratic and angry, traits exacerbated by his heavy drug use. He had a troubled history with law enforcement, including reports of drug dealing at Brighton High School and carrying a weapon. He had once threatened his father with a knife, prompting a SWAT team response. Instead of being placed in a safe or a rehabilitative environment, Liam was bailed to a house known for drug activity and underage drinking, a decision that defies comprehension. Liam's escalating behaviour should have raised red flags. At one point, he gained access to a gun, recklessly discharging it in a public park and inside a house. Despite at least 5 interactions with police related to drugs, he was only given drug diversion programs rather than facing meaningful consequences. Each encounter was a missed opportunity to intervene before tragedy struck. On the fateful night, Lewis, James and Liam T were walking to a New Year's Eve party. Liam Humbles approached Lewis and his friends, visibly intoxicated and hostile, wearing only a pair of black track pants. He had been drinking heavily, with a blood alcohol level of 0.25, 5 times the legal driving limit in Australia, and was high on methamphetamine and cannabis. Agitated from an earlier argument at another party over a drug deal gone wrong, Liam's anger boiled over. Lewis and his friends were acquaintances of Liam, having attended the same school. When James greeted him with a casual, "What's up?" Liam responded aggressively, shouting expletives. He then pointed a gun at James from just 2 metres away, firing 1 shot at him and 2 at Lewis before firing another shot, possibly aimed at Liam T. James later described the horrific moment. "I looked to my right and saw a blood stain on Lewis's shirt, just above his right pectoral. He clutched it with his left hand, stumbled back, tried to yell but couldn't scream. He took about 3 steps back and slowly fell back. I rushed to his side and held him in my hands and tried to keep him from choking on his blood because he was losing blood." Liam ran away from the scene as Lewis collapsed, unconscious. His friends and nearby neighbours tried desperately to save him, but their efforts were interrupted when Liam returned with the gun just 2 minutes later. Terrified for their lives, James and Liam T fled. Liam stood over Lewis, pressed the gun into his abdomen and chillingly said, "If you don't stop being dead, I'm going to make you really dead." Once Liam fled again, Lewis's friends returned to his side, but it was too late. Lewis had succumbed to his injuries. Liam Humbles was arrested and charged with the murder of Lewis McPherson and the attempted murder of James and Liam T. Even after the incident, Liam showed little remorse, refusing to fully accept responsibility for the senseless murder of Lewis McPherson. He claimed that he could not remember the shooting due to his heavy drug and alcohol consumption that night. During the trial, Liam's mother, Elizabeth, placed blame on the police for their failure to act on her repeated pleas for help with her son's violent and erratic behaviour. She had turned to social workers and child mental health services, but felt her concerns were ignored. Devastated, she admitted on the stand, "I blame myself, of course I effing do. I blame myself every effing day." Liam was sentenced to a minimum of 23 years in prison for his crimes. Unfortunately, he was able to appeal this decision and his sentence was reduced to a minimum of 17 years. This tragic case highlights systemic failures in addressing at-risk youth, the dangers of substance abuse, and the devastating consequences of gun violence. Lewis McPherson's life was taken far too soon, leaving his loved ones to grieve a loss that could have been prevented.